Bonneville that doesn't shift into overdrive. I suspect that the splines on the fourth gear shaft are sheared off, so I'm going to replace it. The first thing I'm going to do is disconnect the negative battery cable. The battery is located under the back seat. To remove the cushion, just reach under the front of it and pull up on both sides. Next, I'm going to remove the air cleaner inlet duct. There's an air temperature sensor that has to be removed first. And then loosen the intake air duct clamp. Then remove the intake duct. You do not need to remove the front of the air box, but I'm going to just to give myself a little more room to work. Next, I'm going to remove the shift cable bracket. It's mounted to the side of the cover and is two 13mm nuts. Remove the left front tire. I'm going to remove this inner splash shield. You just pop out these plastic rivets. Now I'm going to remove the outer tie rod. There's a cotter key on here to remove, and then take this nut off. This is an 18mm nut. There's a special tool for popping these tie rod ends off. If you don't have that tool, you can take a hammer and pound on the outside to loosen it up. And then I put the nut back on most of the way so I don't mess up the threads, and then just pop that. And then you can remove the tie rod end. Now I'm going to remove the stabilizer shaft link bolt, and that's a 14mm. Now I'm going to remove the ball joint. There'll be another cotter pin and a nut that takes an 18mm wrench. Once you have the nut loose, then you can pound on the lower control arm to loosen the ball joint. And then carefully put some pressure on it and pry it out. Now I'm going to remove this nut from the rotor. I'm going to drop a punch through the rotor and put it up against the caliper to prevent the rotor from turning while I'm loosening the nut. I want to remove this strut to give me more access to this area, so I'm going to start with taking the calipers off, and there's a little bracket here that'll have to be removed, and then I'll tie the calipers up and finish removing the rest of this. Now I'm going to remove this caliper bracket so I can get the rotor off. And there's 2 bolts that hold this on. And they are 15 millimeter. Now I can remove the rotor. And now I'm pushing the axle out of the hub. If the axle sticks, you can put a punch in the center and give it a couple taps to loosen it. You don't want to pound on the edge because you may damage the threads. I'm going to unplug this cable that's on the strut here, and then there's one more connection here. This just pops out. To finish removing the strut, there are 3 15 millimeter bolts on the top of the strut tower. Now I need to pop this drive shaft off, so I'm going to stick a pry bar in here and press that off. There's a pinch bolt that holds the steering shaft to the steering gear, and you have to remove this boot to get to it. When you have the boot pried up, you can see the pinch bolt. It's easier to get to from the top. And there you can see it under the boot. And that bolt takes an 11 millimeter socket. I moved this shaft up, and I've used some wire to tie the boot up so it doesn't fall out. Next I'm going to remove the 3 bolts that hold the frame on to the left side. One of them is way up front here, so I'll have to remove this air shield to get to it. Remove the bolts for the ABS modulator. There's one on the frame top here, and there's one in the front of the frame, and one inside the wheel housing here. Now I'm going to remove the nut for this transmission support. This nut takes a 21 millimeter socket. This transmission mount bracket just to give me a little more clearance in this area. There's a nut on either side and then one on the inside of the frame. In here. And they use an 18mm wrench. Now I need to lower the frame so I can get to these bottom bolts on the transmission cover. So I'm going to have to remove this mount in the back of the transmission, and there's another mount in the front. So now I have the two mounts disconnected, and the transmission is supported on some blocks. And so I have room to get around the whole perimeter of the cover and remove the bolts. The bolts around the perimeter take a 13mm socket. There are 4 more bolts along the bottom that use a T40 Torx. You want to make sure you have all the dirt and grease cleaned out of these so you can get that Torx driver all the way in there. And it might be a good idea just to tap the end a couple times to make sure it's all the way in. To remove this plug from the top of the transmission cover, you have to pinch the sides together and then pull it straight out. And now I can remove the cover. Next, I'm going to remove this wiring harness. I'm going to start taking these plugs out. This first one, you just pinch and remove it. And this next one, just pull this out. That one comes off. And this one, same way, just pull this out and slide it out. Just pry the bottom open and then it comes right out. There's another plug over here. Just pull this out, slip it out, and one down here. One down here on this solenoid. And another one just below there. Just a little spring clip here, and one left on the bottom. This one on the bottom just pops right out of this clip. And now the wiring harness. Oh, there's one more back here. Just pops out. Okay, now the wiring harness is completely loose. Next, I'm going to remove the oil pump. There are 9 bolts around the perimeter that use an 8mm socket, and 2 at the top that you need a 10mm socket. And this silver one leave in place. And here is the oil pump removed. I'm going to remove this bracket next so I can remove this linkage. And this takes an 8mm socket. Once you have the screw removed, then you can just remove this part here. This rod, you just pull the spring back, and then the rod will drop down from this shaft. You can just rotate it out of the way. I want to take this cover off, but leave this valve body intact, so I'm only going to take out the screws needed for that. But to get to a couple of them, you have to remove these 2 solenoids here. There's a couple screws behind them, so I'll start with that. So to remove this, just pop this clip out, and it should pop right out. And then the next one. So I'm going to leave in this bolt and these 2, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. See down here, these 2, and the one underneath. And the rest of these come out. There's one back here, around here, Down here is a little one under here. This is it takes an 8mm socket. The rest of these are 10. There's a 13 here. At the bottom of the case is this little screw. It's an M6 screw, and it takes a T30 Torx driver to remove it. And now you should be able to remove this whole case here. Once the cover is removed, we can get to the 4th gear hub. And as you can see, all the splines are worn off here, and that's why I don't have overdrive.